Where it was, yes, it was in a VA hospital.
They used to give out a couple cans of beer a day
Yep.
here in Palo Alto. And then on Sundays, the Paralyzed Veterans of America local chapter would come in and
Yes.
take everybody out drinking.
Absolutely. It was a person, unfortunately, in the Boston area working in a VA and was part of this.
Okay.
All right, I think we're good. I think we can go ahead and get started. John, if you're ready. Welcome everybody to the Access to Recovery Supports for People with Disabilities. Our presenter today, some of you may have already met him, is John D. Miranda. And just go ahead and kind of introduce him. John has a professional background in the human services field that spans 40+ years. He has served as program administrator, management consultant, therapist, educator, government official, quality leader, research, and trainer. He is the son of a Cuban immigrant and graduated from Boston Latin, followed in graduation from Wesley University in Connecticut with a bachelor's degree in sociology. He earned a master's degree in counseling and consulting psychology from Harvard University. He's conducted multiple research projects and published on topics including special education, responsible alcoholic beverage service, consumer self-determination, and all the way through legal legislative policies. He was awarded a 2019 and 20 Tobacco Harm Reduction Scholarship from Knowledge Action,
This is Aiden speaking.
a program of the Foundation for a Smoke-Free World. If everybody will please go ahead and mute while John does his talk. There will be some time at the very end for a Q&A session. And if you do have questions, if you will just put those in the group chat, I'll be monitoring those for him. And with that, John, we'll let you take the floor.
Thank you, Kelly. Okay, for starters, I'd like to give a little bit of background and history of how I got interested in this issue. Probably.
How did you get in contact with him yesterday or the day before yesterday?
Can you turn off your mics? Okay. Hello? You can mute everybody, Kelly, if you're the host. So.
Yep, I'm muting everybody.
Okay, so about 30 years ago, I was a relatively early career person working in the alcohol and drug field, looking to make a difference and looking to make a mark. And one day I was sitting in my office. I was working for County Alcohol and Drug Services at the time. I got a flyer in the mail that basically invited us to attend a meeting at Stanford University. I was working in San Mateo County at the time. There was going to be a meeting to focus on alcohol and drug problems among people with disabilities. And I thought to myself, well, gee, I've been in the field now for quite some time, a person in long-term recovery myself, but I didn't ever recall seeing any references to people with disabilities as a special group or as a special population. And I thought, well, maybe I'll go to this meeting and, learn some things. That was the beginning of a lifelong involvement that kind of ebbed and flowed through my professional career. There were times when in a given year, maybe 10 or 15% of my work would involve people with disabilities, access to alcohol and drug services for people with disabilities, and other years where 100% of my time was focused on the issue. And there's been a lot of work done, a lot of papers written, a lot of presentations made. And I think in some ways the issue of people with disabilities
Hold on.
has moved from essentially zero to something that is now part of the backdrop of the alcohol and drug field, where we now know that our programs have to be accessible. We need to kind of train ourselves around aspects of disability and inclusiveness for people with disabilities. At the same time, I got very involved in understanding the Americans with Disabilities Act. Originally, because this was a kind of a big stick to try and get alcohol and drug programs to be more accessible for people with physical, mobility, sensory, and cognitive disabilities. But also eventually it became of interest to me that the Americans with Disabilities Act actually provided protections for people in recovery like myself against discrimination. And our organization, the National Association on Alcohol, Drugs, and Disability, got very involved in educating the addiction world about those protections. I think it's safe to say that there was a time when the idea that somebody in recovery had a federal protection against discrimination provided by disability law was really unknown in the alcohol and drug field 35 years ago. That's not the case today. It's very different. There have been a number of high-profile cases involving the Supreme Court, actually, that have underscored this. But we're not here to talk about that today. We're here to talk about people with disabilities and to talk practically about what a recovery community organization can do to be more welcoming and more accommodating and more adaptive for people that have physical, sensory, mobility, cognitive disabilities. And let me say too that the meat and potatoes of this workshop is really in you downloading the tip sheets that were created by SAMHSA that I'll reference in a few minutes. And using those tip sheets to really guide your programs and to assist you both in preparing for people with disabilities to come into your programs and then also responding when somebody with a disability comes in and needs certain adaptations and modifications. So next slide, please. Okay, a couple of just kind of information points and context setting points. People with disabilities are already in your programs. They're already, in your treatment programs, in your recovery community centers. The fact is, though, that you probably don't know it, and that a lot of disabilities are what we consider hidden disabilities. And in fact, even the term disability, which has its own...
We have to have a mask on when we greet these people, though.
Oh. Okay. It has its own negative connotation. And when you're talking with somebody who's coming into your program, you might have a checklist, a kind of a typical health checklist. Have you ever had, bronchitis and heart disease and cancer, et cetera? And there's probably a question on there about disability, but in fact, it's the kind of question that a lot of people won't answer. If instead you ask about limitations, do you have any limitations that we need to know about in our program? Then you're likely to hear, well, yeah, I have a problem hearing in my left ear. The person doesn't see that as a disability, they just see that as a limitation or an impairment. Also, by asking that kind of exploratory, low-key question, do you have any limitations? You might hear that somebody has low back problems and that when they have to sit for periods of time, they get back spasms. Well, that's an important piece of information to know if your groups run 40 minutes or 45 minutes. And you might want to make that evident to the group that this person is maybe going to join so that he has permission to get up and maybe stretch a little bit during the meeting to alleviate his back spasticity. All of these are very simple kinds of accommodations or adaptations. But if you were to ask, do you have a disability? You'd get a no answer, and that would be the end of the conversation. You wouldn't learn about that functional limitation. So it's important to see disability on a spectrum. We tend to have, this view of people with disabilities as being in a wheelchair or on a gurney, but in fact, fully 16 to 17% of the population has a functional disability, which is the largest diversity group of any group in the United States. So it is a potentially big population and one that we need to take seriously. And because we don't accommodate it very well, we have people that fail our programs, not because they can't get it, but because we haven't created the welcoming environment, the comfortability environment that allows them to fully appreciate the services that we're trying to provide. Most of these accommodations are low cost. We're not necessarily talking about constructing a new facility or even constructing a ramp. You can buy portable ramps, and there are lots of solutions for making programs more accessible. We tend to think that ramps, access means a ramp and a sign, but in fact, there's quite a bit involved in trying to make your program fully accessible for people with the whole spectrum of disabilities. Next slide, please. There's a concept that we coined a number of years ago called disabiliphobia. And I take this from my own experience. When I attended that first committee meeting at Stanford University, it was a really kind of an eye-opening experience for me, because all of a sudden I was in a room with a number of people who had what we would consider pretty significant disabilities. Deafness, blindness, mobility limitations. And it was kind of an eye-opener for me to realize how little interaction I had had with people like this over the course of my years up to that point. And I was very conscious of my own discomfort and my own anxiety about maybe saying the wrong thing or doing the wrong thing. And I think a lot of people share this. You see it sometimes in a supermarket. There'll be somebody in a wheelchair, and there might be a child nearby who's very intrigued by this little power wheelchair, but mom or dad is kind of shooing them away. Don't bother this person. Leave them alone. Well, one of the things I've learned is that people with disabilities are just like everybody else. They often, like to talk about themselves and welcome the opportunity to describe to a child what a power wheelchair does or why they have to use it. And in fact, that really is the key to understanding their needs to accommodate them in your program. That asking that person what they need or how the program could flex to be more accessible for them, because they are really the experts on their disability. And one of the things, one of the mistakes we make sometimes is thinking, well, we had a client who had a problem with, let's say, the condition that person had was cerebral palsy. Well, we get another client in who acknowledges that they have had cerebral palsy, they have cerebral palsy related conditions. We might think that based on the first experience, we know what that's about. In reality, that's not the case at all. That for cerebral palsy and for a lot of conditions, it is very particular to the individual, what their needs are and what will help them be comfortable in the program. So they are the expert. They inform us as to what they need. Also at the same time, we'll talk a little bit more about this, but it's important to recognize that terminology, just as terminology is important in the alcohol and drug field, and we have our, different terminology of the du jour, same thing within the disability world. Let me give you a couple of examples. When I was doing some studies that involved working with deaf agencies in California, I learned the hard way that within the deaf community, the term disability is a non-starter, okay? People who are deaf do not embrace and often totally reject the term disability because they don't see the problem as being resident in them. They see the problem as being resident in the lack of accessibility within the larger society. The fact that we don't have TDDs, that we don't have adequate levels of sign language interpretation, etc. They see that as the problem, that these are communications problems, not problems involving the pathology of an individual. And to walk into a meeting and to use the term disability without understanding that that really is a taboo term just means you're going to have a very, very negative reception. So I often like to, when I'm engaging somebody that has some kind of disabling condition, really ask them how they prefer to, to be termed or to be called. I've been on my board of directors. There have been a number of people who are short-statured and have very specific ideas about what terms should be used to describe them as short-stature individuals. And that's one of the preferred terms that one of them use, but that might be very different for the next person. So we always need to keep in mind that people will inform us and that we need to be careful about any language that might be stigmatizing. It used to be that you would see the term handicapped quite often. And if you follow this for, let's say, 20 years, you'll see less and less use of the term handicap, although it still survives, just like substance abuse survives within our world, handicap survives. But one of the reasons some people don't like it is that it refers to a time many, centuries ago almost, when people who were disabled had no public support and would have to beg on the street with a handicap. Okay, so next slide, please. So we talked a little bit about the Americans with Disabilities Act. Interestingly enough, the ADA, when it was being passed, and I've spent considerable amount of time historically in trying to understand where the Americans with Disabilities Act came from, how the disability rights movement over a period of about 5 years worked the Congress and the American public to get the ADA passed in 1990. And I've been very curious about the fact that within the Americans with Disabilities Act, there are protections for people in active alcoholism, in recovery from drug addiction, and in recovery from alcoholism. Not protections for people actively using illicit drugs. And I've learned in my research and in my history that really the disability community that came together to pass the ADA really saw itself philosophically as an inclusive movement, and therefore included people with addictions, people with in recovery from addictions, despite the fact that within the political coalition that came together and fought to have the ADA enacted, there were no players from the alcohol and drug world. Okay, because at that time and subsequently, people within the alcohol and drug field just did not see themselves within the terminology and the paradigm of disability. And I have written on this subject over the years. Let me just try and, drop a little bit of a provocation here. We spend a lot of time arguing about whether addiction is a disease or not. And I teach new counselors at the University of California, Berkeley, and the University of California, San Diego. And we spend a lot of time, kind of talking about, well, what is a disease? What isn't a disease? And you can argue it any number of ways. Within the community that I'm speaking to right now, within the ARCO conference, I'm sure there is widespread unanimity that addiction is a disease. But if you go out into the larger world and you ask lay people, or lo and behold, ask a bunch of psychologists, you'll get a different answer. Learned behavior, et cetera, et cetera. And, we need to be conscious of this because disability is really more of a legal term and an administrative term rather than a diagnostic term. That's why we have the term disability when it comes to people with addictive disease who lost SSI benefits in 1996. It was because of the administrative change that said after 1996, people with addictive disease are no longer eligible for supplemental security income. Okay, and just to underscore how this is an administrative issue, that change was made by the Republican Congress that swept into Capitol Hill under the leadership of Newt Gingrich, and his promise with the Covenant with America that there would be an end to the coddling of drug addicts and people with drug addiction. And then in fact, they won't be considered disabled anymore. So we lost those protections. Up until 1996, if you had addictive disease and you were living in a single room occupancy in some inner city, you got an SSI check that helped you live, that helped you pay your rent and put food on the table and maybe bought you a little bit of booze on the side. Well, we in the alcohol and drug field, we were not happy with those people. So when the Republicans moved to eliminate SSI eligibility for people with addictive disease, we said, okay, that's okay with us. We don't understand that. We're not part of that. Go right ahead. But in fact, we had a big loss. And in fact, I've had conversations with people at Faces and Voices over the years about trying to bring that back. Because if we really are disabled, if we really are part of the disability community and coalition, we should be entitled to an SSI benefit for people in recovery from addictive disease. But I've gotten a little bit ahead of myself or beside myself. So the ADA is important for a number of reasons, but for purposes of our workshop, it's important because if you have an RCO, if you have an addiction treatment program, you're obligated under various titles of the Americans with Disabilities Act to provide services for these individuals, just as McDonald's is required to provide accessibility for people with disabilities. RCOs and treatment providers hold themselves out as providing services to the public, which means they have to be accessible. On top of that is of course, the overlay that if you're receiving federal dollars, you have even more obligations to provide accommodations. So next slide, please. So this is one of the tip sheets, one of the 6 tip sheets that were developed by Brass Tacks. This happened a couple of years ago. A couple of years ago, I got a call from Natalie Gold at Brass Tacks and said, we have some money from SAMHSA. We'd like to develop some tools specifically for recovery community organizations to become more accessible for people with disabilities. So we developed, with some help from some others, these tip sheets. We had a seminar on Brass Tacks, a webinar that focused on this issue. I think that might still be available in the archive of Brass Tacks. And I would encourage all of you to download copies of these and use them in your program, share them with other individuals, because they really are the nuts and bolts of what to do if you've got somebody with a vision impairment, for example, or if you want to create a program that's really friendly and accommodating for somebody with a vision limitation or who's blind or deaf or who's has a hearing limitation. Next slide, please. And this is where you would get them. This is the link that brings you directly to the site that holds those tip sheets. And if you don't get this off the PowerPoint or right off the website, send me an email and I can send you the link. Next slide, please. Okay, so let's do a little bit of Disability 101. Major categories of disability in the United States: mobility, sometimes referred to as physical disabilities, although physical disabilities for some people can include sensory disabilities. So I like to break them out and say mobility, and then developmental. There are 4 developmental disabilities: autism, cerebral palsy, epilepsy, and mental retardation. We have a national network of developmental services that are funded by the federal government to provide support for families where a child is born with one of these disabilities. In order to qualify as a developmental disability, it must show up before the age of 18. And we have, I have a lot of resources regarding developmental disabilities. If this is an area that you're particularly interested in, I would encourage you to send me an email. I will send you links to some of the places where you can get really a lot of assistance in helping someone with a developmental disability. Cognitive disabilities, i.e. brain injury usually, is what this reflects. Many of our veterans have brain injuries or subclinical brain injuries that go undetected. And often because of these cognitive disabilities, as well as low levels of developmental disabilities, we have people in our programs who don't get the program because they can't get the program, okay? Because we are using, for example, highly abstract language within the alcohol and drug field, and because we have not made efforts to ratchet down the high levels of abstraction for people with low cognitive thresholds, they can't get it because they can't get it. Let me give you one example. I can provide this link subsequent to this workshop if you want. But just think for a minute about the 12 steps, okay? The 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous. The fourth step is a great example of the cognitive inaccessibility of much of our material. We made we made a fearless and searching moral inventory. That is the fourth step of Alcoholics Anonymous. Now, if you want to unpack that phrase, it is loaded with abstractions. Fearless, searching, moral, inventory. These are all very abstract concepts. When I first heard of a moral inventory, I thought, well, wait a minute. Inventory is what happens at Safeway at 2 o'clock in the morning. What is a searching and fearless moral inventory? And think about maybe the first time you heard that fourth step. Did you understand it? My guess is you scratched your head and said, well, what? However, a translated version of the 12 steps would present that as follows. We made a list of things, good and bad, about ourselves. Now, when you hear that for the first time, you pretty much know what it means. But a searching and fearless moral inventory? You know, even terms like alcohol become problematic. If you are somebody with a low level of education or English as a second language, well, alcohol can mean something you rub on your body. It can mean something you pump into your car, or it can mean Budweiser. So why not hold up a Budweiser can, say, this is what we're talking about. That's concrete. So these are some of the kind of the reasons and the needs for changing and being a little bit more helpful to people with low levels of cognitive ability. Then sensory disabilities, vision and hearing. We've talked a little bit about deafness. And then behavioral. You know, more and more we are seeing the term substance use disorder gets subsumed under mental health condition or under behavioral health. There's lots of good and bad reasons for this, and we don't have time for that today, but behavioral disabilities like substance use disorder or mental health issues also fall under the protections of the Americans with Disabilities Act. Next slide, please. Okay, I've talked about the 16% rule. 1 in 6 Americans have a functional limitation. You can call it a disability or you can call it a limitation. And this includes hidden disabilities such as chronic pain, hearing loss, or intellectual impairments. Many people with functional limitations do not identify as disabled, but can benefit from program accommodations. There is a concept known as universal accessibility. This concept is used a lot in architectural design, so that when you build a a curb cut into a sidewalk. You help somebody with a wheelchair who uses a wheelchair. You help a mom or dad pushing a baby carriage. You help somebody on a skateboard, which maybe isn't a good idea, but you're helping somebody on a skateboard, and you're helping somebody with a wheelbarrow, okay? This is universal design. And the more we can create communities with high levels of universal design, the more accessible the community is. Another issue is that minority populations, veterans and older adults all experience higher incidence of disabilities and functional limitations. So if we want to hold ourselves out as specializing in or having a particular, focus on these populations, we need to create environments where people are going to thrive. Next slide, please. This is my second workshop. I'm really about to lose my voice. Let's hope I can make it to the end, to the question period. So we've talked about language a little bit. We get from the disability world the concept of person-first language. And I think person-first language is really, has been absorbed into the alcohol and drug field, where we are more likely now to talk about ourselves as somebody with a substance use disorder rather than an alcoholic or an addict. We know that those terms have negative connotations, and creating a person-first version, as we learn from the disability community, is a good idea. People do not like to be referred to as their limitations. They do not like to be referred to as their pathology. So using terminology like a person with spinal cord injury or a person who uses a wheelchair is much more palatable than he's a paraplegic or some version of that. And then there are a lot of stigmatizing terms specifically within the disability world. I mentioned handicap before. Terms like crippled, wheelchair bound. A lot of these terms really kind of stay with the culture. I know that there have been for many years efforts from the disability community to try and get reporters and Hollywood and television producers to use more, less stigmatizing, more affirmative language. And I think the results have been kind of mixed and pretty slow. But as much as possible, recognize that you probably don't know what you don't know. And when you're sitting across the desk or welcoming somebody into your agency who has some kind of condition and you have some forewarning of that, put on your educate me hat, not your I'm a professional hat, and let them do that. Let them educate you about what they need, how they like to be referred to, etc. Next slide, please. Disability etiquette. We've talked a little bit about engaging people, how to engage people. But it's also important to welcome service animals. And I know that this is an issue for many retail operations. I've had this experience as someone who's the CEO of an addiction treatment program because of the proliferation of non-service service animals, okay? We have, in our culture, the original impetus was seeing eye dogs, and then that expanded some to other kinds of well-trained and essentially certified by the state service animals that would help people with disabilities or limitations. I know from direct experience that anybody can get a certification online that says their little pet Fido is a service animal and should be allowed to sit in the movie theater with them and enjoy their popcorn. Or come to their treatment program and sit in on the group therapy session that they participate in. So you want to make sure your agency has a well thought out policy regarding service animals and is prepared to, enforce it or not enforce it. It's just an area where there's a lot of differences of opinion. My understanding of one of the agencies that I work with is that only a seeing eye dog or a service animal that has been licensed and certified by the state is allowed in. But that creates its own problems because people often feel that's discriminatory. So I'll leave that to you. Encourage self-identification. And when I will often introduce myself in the context or in the environment of doing some training, I'll say, I have 2 hidden disabilities. Would anybody like to guess what they are? And, you know, almost everybody can get the fact, because I've maybe identified myself as a person in long-term recovery, that that's one of them, that I'm a person in recovery. But also I'm a person with a history of seizure disorders that was very active during my drinking, but has been totally in remission since I stopped drinking. But because the Americans with Disabilities Act defines someone with a disability as not just somebody with a disability, but somebody with a history of disability, theoretically, I fall under the protections of the ADA for each of those conditions. Another aspect of disability etiquette is to offer, offer assistance, offer assistive devices. We now, most programs should have some assistive listening devices available for clients. And it's also important to remember that we have an obligation to be accessible for employees and for staff. And there is no better way to become sensitive to the needs of people with disabilities than to hire somebody with a disability or bring somebody on your board who has a disability and is a disability advocate. They will help you get where you need to get in order to be accommodating for other people. Next slide, please. A couple of other things. When I first started in this work some 35 years ago, we did a number of studies that basically found treatment programs were totally inaccessible. That in fact, ramps didn't exist, signage for handicap parking, etc. That these programs were largely inaccessible. Here in California, we were doing that kind of training and teaching and advocacy, but it was an uphill battle until some people started filing lawsuits against addiction treatment programs for not accommodating people with disabilities. And that changed things overnight because all of a sudden funders became very interested in making sure that addiction treatment programs were not just doing what they were supposed to do with people that required their services, but were doing what they were supposed to do under the Americans with Disabilities Act and Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, which requires all recipients of federal dollars to not discriminate against people with disabilities. Ramps are not enough. The disability tip sheets that I referenced earlier essentially are checklists too for you to go through to see how are we doing in terms of accessibility for somebody with a developmental disability, or how are we doing for somebody who's blind or vision impaired. And there are many ways to accommodate people that don't necessarily cost a lot of money. You can go out and buy telecommunications devices for the deaf. And if you've got a number of staff, that could be very expensive. Or you could train staff in how to use your state's relay system. All states have relay systems where there are operators standing by who are willing to relay your telephone conversation to somebody who uses a telecommunications device for the deaf. And these are at no cost to you, other than whatever costs there might be for training your staff and keeping them informed and up to date on how to use these services. Next slide, please. And these are some of the other ways that programs can be made more accessible. A lot of these items are not terribly expensive. and you can kind of see for yourself. I think the next slide has a chart with some of these items. And again, a lot of this is derived from these brass tacks tip sheets, so I won't kind of go over it. I want to leave some time for questions. And hopefully you will get those things. Next slide, please. Yes. As a program, you should know that any video you might show in a public setting really should provide also the ability to be closed captioned so that somebody can see subtitles if they have difficulty hearing. You want to also make sure you know where you can get sign language interpreters and what the resources might be to pay for those interpreter services. In many counties here in California, it's the county behavioral health department within the county government that pays for interpreter services because of the cost associated with it. And you want to make sure your staff is trained in disability issues, going through similar kind of training to this, and making sure that your brochures and websites are all providing welcoming language. I mean, if you have a brochure or you have website materials, and you have, let's say, the ability to talk to somebody with a hearing impairment over a telecommunications device for the deaf or over the California relay system here in California, if your brochure doesn't acknowledge that fact, you really can't expect people in the deaf and hard of hearing community to think you're going to be able to help them, okay? But having that available and having that mentioned in your brochure and on your websites is a welcoming signal that you are a deaf-friendly, hearing-impaired-friendly service. Next slide, please. Think about invitations and announcements in alternative formats, making sure that you have the ability on your website to provide to an individual alternative format information. If you put a PDF on your website that is, you know, a document you want people to have, you should also have available a voice version of it, or a version that can be translated into text for use by somebody who is deaf or who's blind but uses a not a Braille converter, but a print to voice converter to read the document. Okay, more stuff, more ways to make your program more accessible. I think we'll take the next slide, which will be the last slide, and then I'll be quiet for a while. Oh yes, let's take a minute here. Within your community, one of the best resources to help you get from where you are to where you want to be in terms of accommodations are your independent living centers. There are several hundred in the United States. They're all funded by federal and state dollars, and they exist to help businesses, organizations, nonprofits serve people with disabilities. They can provide training to your staff. They can provide equipment. They can provide expertise. And I would encourage all of you to find out who are the local independent living centers. Also, there are peer programs within the developmental and mental health fields that can be very helpful to your clients or some of your clients. There are disability advocacy and rights agencies that you should know about, and it would be a good idea to inform them about your status as a protected class under the Americans with Disabilities Act, because oftentimes they don't include us in their thinking about what constitutes the disability community, but in fact, we are a protected class. And then there are local supported employment programs and supportive living programs that can be very helpful to some of the clients you might be serving. Next slide. SAMHSA published a document under their TIP series. The TIP series is the Treatment Improvement Protocols. And TIP 29 is really the Bible for a lot of what we've been talking about. You have your tip sheets from brass tacks, but TIP 29 is also a place to get a lot of good information about how to accommodate people with disabilities. And there's a pamphlet too from Alcoholics Anonymous that directly addresses special needs and how various individuals with disabilities have been helped by Alcoholics Anonymous. So I'm going to pause there. We have about 10 minutes, I think. Does that sound right, Kelly?
I think we go to 3:15.
Oh, really? Okay. Well,
So you
let's
have
see.
some time. We got a few questions, unless you want to go over something else.
No, let's go open to questions.
Okay. The first one I have is from Lewis. He wants to know, excuse me, is there a resource available to understand what terms are best to use?
Well, yes. The tip sheets have some information. The tip 29 has some information, but it's a moving target. Just as we often change our minds within the alcohol and drug field about what's the right term to use. At one point it was substance abuse. Now that's pretty much out the window in favor of substance use disorder. At one time we saw a lot of programs, especially in the Midwest, refer to themselves as chemical dependency programs. We don't see a whole lot of that today. It's more substance use disorder. So it does change over time. And you can never be sure that you're up to date unless you are really immersed in the field itself or interacting with people from the disability community. And even there, you won't necessarily find agreement between a leader within the disability advocacy world and somebody who has a disability, who's a service recipient. They could be kind of worlds apart in how they view these issues.
Okay, the next question is from Brandy. She said, would ADHD be considered behavioral? And do you have resources for parents that have children under 10 for help? And then lastly, any advice for such parents?
Okay. So the whole area of learning disabilities is a kind of a gray area regarding the Americans with Disabilities Act. Just to underscore how this stuff works is, when the Congress passed the ADA in 1990 and the first George Bush president signed it into law, it was a broad kind of architecture for protecting people with disabilities. The actual practice, though, really is a result of case law over time. So, for example, people with chemical sensitivities, okay, somebody who has difficulty with, cologne and perfume, they brought their cases on many occasions to be held under the Americans with Disabilities Act, and courts have rejected them. So there is no protection for multiple chemical sensitivity within the ADA because of how the courts have ruled. So the learning disability issue kind of falls into the same category. If you can determine and get a kind of a certification that this is a developmental disability under one of those four categories, yes, the protections would adhere to that individual. But if there wasn't a definitive conclusion from a state developmental disability agency that this person qualified and was eligible for developmental services because of their cognitive limitations, then you would probably not have the full protections of the ADA for somebody with ADHD. So it's this kind of gray, murky area. And I'm sorry it's not clear. And then the question about young people, what was that again, Kelly?
The question was about if there were any resources for parents with children under 10 with ADHD or any advice for their parents.
Well, your state developmental service agency, the way developmental services are organized is not that different from alcohol and drug services or mental health services. basically the federal government makes available to the states block grants to provide services for developmental disabilities, as they do for addiction treatment. So your state developmental agency is really the first stop for any parent of a child where they suspect or have concerns about the developmental appropriateness of the child as they're growing up. And I know here in California, for example, the services that are available, if that determination is made, the determination of eligibility, the kinds of resources and the amounts of money involved in those resources that can support that child are very large. So really, that's the first place to go to look. Then often the state developmental service agencies fund local community-based organizations, just like our state alcohol and drug agencies fund local treatment programs. And those local developmental service centers, here in California, they're known as developmental centers, actually, or where a lot of the support and a lot of the services are actually delivered once eligibility is identified. If you'd like more information about this or to discuss it, depending on your state, send me an email or give me a call and we can talk offline.
Okay, and one of the questions was, could you talk more about your statement, I have a hidden disability, I'm in recovery?
Well, as a person, let me tell you a story instead. One of the founders of Faces and Voices of Recovery, even before Faces and Voices of Recovery had a name, was a woman named Susan Rook, R-O-O-K. Susan had a very interesting story to tell, and I heard her tell it once, and it went back to the beginnings of cable news network. Those of you who are younger may not remember that at one point CNN stood for Cable News Network. Today it's just CNN. But when the network was first created, Susan Rook had a talk show, and it was one of the first talk shows in television history. It was called Talk Back Live with Susan Rook. It preceded Larry what's his name, and all the others. And Susan had a cocaine problem and a drinking problem. She left CNN, and a couple of years later entered into her own recovery path. And the way she told the story, if I remember it correctly, was a few years after that, she was recruited by a Fortune 200 company to be their vice president of communications. And she was recruited by a headhunter who heard her speaking about her recovery and thought she was very good at communication. It was what she had her college degree in. It's what she had cut her teeth on at CNN. And this headhunter said she'd be a great person to have as our VP of corporate communications. So she was interviewed. She went through the whole process. She was offered a job. Compensation was agreed to. Start date was agreed to. And finally, she was told, well, the only thing you have to do now is you have to go up to the executive suite and talk to our COO or CEO, who likes to meet all the new senior executives before pulling the plug or pulling the trigger, or whatever metaphor you want to use. So she goes into this meeting to have a cup of coffee and chat with this guy. And she says along the way, do you have any questions about my recovery? Well, his jaw drops. He looks at her and says, recovery from what? And she said, well, I'm a recovering drug addict, and I'm surprised you don't know. I've been talking to all the people throughout these interviews about my recovery background. In fact, that's how your human resource person found me. I'm surprised. The next thing the CEO said was, why would we want somebody like you to represent us? He asked her to leave. She left, embarrassed, ashamed, shocked. And he had just violated federal law. He made an employment decision solely on the fact of her history as a person in recovery. That is a violation of federal law. And that's what I mean by, you know, protections of people in recovery under the ADA. There is a great resource available from SAMHSA, might even be available on the Faces and Voices website, called Know Your Rights, K-N-O-W, Your Rights. It is a 16-page pamphlet, manual, if you will, that outlines all the federal laws that protect people with addictive disease or in recovery from addictive disease from discrimination. And I would encourage you all to download that and keep it on your desk. And when you have a client, or let's say a program participant, who is very excited about maybe returning to work and being able to share their newfound recovery status with others, you know, maybe you would caution them a little bit that, you know, not everybody is as enthusiastic about people in recovery as you might think, and maybe being a little bit more strategic about how you disclose that information would be a good idea. So.
Okay, just a couple more questions. One is print to voice. Any good recommendations on software that does this?
No, but this is where your local independent living center can really help you. They're up to date on all of this stuff, and building a partnership with them, because you'll have more questions, is really a good idea. Inviting them over to learn about what you do, going over to their agency to learn about what they do. And one of the things we found is that oftentimes the independent living centers are struggling with the alcohol and drug problems among their service recipients. So they have wanted our expertise in training staff, in early identification. So, you know, make a friend.
All right, and last question is, you mentioned that you could be emailed for a list of resources. They are requesting what your email is.
Okay. S as in Sam, O-L-A-N-D-A, Solanda at SBC Global, all one word, .net. And I'm in the process of developing a website that will have a lot of information about the National Association on Alcohol, Drugs, and Disability. A lot of our historical documentation will be on the website, and links to articles and things like the Know Your Rights pamphlet, Tip 29, etc. So definitely stay in touch, and we will, if you have a specific need, send me an email, and I'm happy to talk with you. We've not been funded. The NAD is no longer funded, hasn't been funded for many years, but we regularly get emails and calls literally from around the world because we're really one of the very few places, and in some cases, the only places to go for advice or counsel about some of these issues.
Okay, we have, we do wrap up at 3:10, so we have about 8 minutes. We have time for maybe one more question. Looks like Brandy, do you have a question? Do you want to unmute? Shonda wants to know, did you discuss the deaf and hard of hearing at all? And we did hit on that, yes.
Yeah, well, one of the 6 tip sheets deals exclusively with deaf and hard of hearing. So I would encourage you to download all of the tip sheets, but specifically that one, and see if you can't get your questions answered that way.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Anybody else?
Brandy, do you?
She says chat.
Okay. Can you see it, Kelly?
It says
Under the,
yeah. Me as a SUD person, I am protected. My son with ADHD is not, just to be clear. That's under the ADA laws.
Yeah, probably. Probably. And it's important to also say that a person using illicit drugs is not protected by the ADA.
Yeah.
Okay. In recovery from, yes, but actively using illicit drugs, no. And again, this comes down to how courts have ruled. Some courts have said, well, you need to be in recovery for a certain length of time in order for those protections to become real. 6 months, 3 months, there have been a number of different decisions. It's a kind of a moving target. Well, I want to thank you all for your attention, and you know, stay in touch if there's ways that I can help you. Please feel free. And I'm now going to go and give my voice a rest because I've done two of these workshops today. But thank you very much.
Thank you so much for all your attention. And we do have that Know Your Rights under Faces and Voices. If you look under our resources under advocacy, you will find that document.
Definitely get it.
Thank you so much, John, for all your knowledge. We really appreciate you.
All right, Kelly, I hope we talk some more in the future.
Yeah, we will.
Okay.